There was a military service member, former military service member, who came in who claimed to had a UAP experience. He said, I got something in my leg, and they removed it. As they were trying to remove it, it kept moving around. The doctor was trying to, quote unquote, hunt for it. He was very perplexed because when he put under the microscope, it seemed to have its own metabolism. It was moving under its own power and energy, so to speak.
Alien implants, y'all. Have you ever wondered if someone got abducted, if they would be returned with something inside of them, something they couldn't explain? Well, in Luis Elizondo's new book, he explains that he was able to actually hold one of these with his own hands, right, and see it with his own eyes, an implant from potentially an extraterrestrial, right, put into a human being from a former military service member, right, who had an encounter with a UAP and walked away with an implant. So I've got a few clips today to help us dive into this. We're going to be playing a clip from Luis Elizondo's audiobook, as well as an interview he just did with Chris Jericho. That's right, the WWE wrestler. Has a great podcast, and he interviewed Lou, and they talked about the implants. Now, make sure to stay tuned to the end, because I've got a preview of my upcoming interview with UFO researcher Preston Dennett. I've also got a clip of Luis Elizondo on News Nation talking about the alien implants. Let's take a look.
You've actually seen what you believe may well be alien technology, an implant.
I have.
What did you see?
I saw a technical device that had been removed, excised by the Department of Veterans Affairs by a surgeon, a trained physician from a U.S. military service member who claimed to have a UAP encounter. The physician claimed that the object tried to run on him or evade being excised.
So let me get this right. This object, whatever it is, it's a constructed object. It's a technological object.
It's a technological object enveloped in some sort of biological capsule. The current theory is that capsule is there to fool the body as not to create some sort of immune response to a foreign object.
But the physician you spoke to described that object apparently trying to intelligently avoid being captured by the human doctor.
Correct. That is what the doctor reported.
Now, before we get to these next two clips, you can't talk about alien implants unless you bring up Dr. Roger Leir.
I'm Dr. Roger Leir, and I've been doing research in the alien abduction phenomena. Myself and my surgical team has performed 10 surgeries for removal of objects from individuals who allege alien abduction.
Jeremy Corbell had done a documentary about Dr. Roger Leir called Patient 17. Here's a clip.
What are your thoughts?
I'm telling you, it's not from here. This sample did not come from our solar system, much less the Earth.
Cool, so that was a trailer that was just cut for the film, for its premiere. That's what will be going out very soon to people. Hopefully they'll see the movie soon. This is Dr. Roger Leir. He's the man who started the whole concept of cutting these things out of people's bodies. He has now passed away, as we talked about earlier today. This is what it looked like when the X-ray was done of the object. And this is one of the telltale signs, according to Dr. Leir, is that the shape of these things, they're very similar in the patients he's cut them out of, allegedly.
Now, I've got two more clips left for you. I've got two clips left for you. But before we get to Luis Elizondo's audiobook, let's hear what he said on Chris Jericho's podcast about alien implants.
Let's talk about something that kind of fits into your background. You talk about being, I believe you said, like a microbiologist and a parasitologist. You talk about the implants that people get. It's very interesting to me. You said that you actually held one, saw one. You talked about how doctors, when they're trying to remove them, have issues with these implants moving and traveling, the lack of inflammation and all. It's very interesting to me, just that alone. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So there's something in biological terms called an immunocascade. So immuno being immunology and cascade being a response of white blood cells. Anytime you have some sort of infection in the body, there are certain microorganisms, particularly those called spirochetes. I won't nerd out here too much, but spirochetes are highly motile. They're basically have this long little whip tail that kind of goes back and forth, and they move throughout the body. And as they move throughout the body, they create this tremendous damage inside the body, because they're destroying tissue in the process. And as a result, you have this tremendous immunocascade, meaning this white blood cell response trying to come in and not only fight the microorganism, but repair the damage that's been caused as this thing moves through the body. And yet, whatever these are, you call them implants, you can call them whatever you want, don't seem to elicit that same immunocascade response. Meaning some of the doctors, and these are some of them are paid by the U.S. government, when they are trying to remove these things from let's say a veteran who goes in and says, look, I had this weird encounter, and oh, by the way, I got this thing in my leg. When they try to remove it, it moves. And when it moves, you don't have this destructive process. It's almost like a stealth fighter flying behind enemy lines. It's almost as if the body doesn't recognize it or even see it. And so there's no real immunocascade response, which is really, from my perspective, fascinating, because that's really the world I come from, right? It's looking at microbiology and the body's response to microorganisms. And yet, with these things, you don't seem to have that same response. So it's very unusual.
And did you hold one? Did you mention that you had one in your hand?
Yeah, well, I actually had it in a little vial. I wasn't brave enough to actually put it in my hand, and it is a biological aspects to the specimen, so you don't want to contaminate it, right? So I have been in very close proximity enough to look at it with my own eyes. But I also want to say here too, I want to caveat, I am not a medical expert, right? Even though I had the training a long, long time ago in college, I'm not a clinical doctor. I'm not an MD. I'm not a surgeon. So I'm always very careful not to qualify or state something that I don't have the expertise. I'd rather let the doctors do it. So in this particular case, or cases, actually, some of these were actually reviewed by medical experts, PhDs and medical doctors and surgeons and forensics experts. And they noticed some very, very peculiar aspects. It almost seemed to be like a technical device that had encapsulated itself in some sort of the patient's own biological tissue.
Man.
Yeah, very, very perplexing for sure.
And obviously, you don't know what it does or what it's there for.
I don't.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask some of the folks that did more research on it. Not sure how many of them would be willing to have that conversation. But, a lot of research has been done. And I know that the Department of Veterans Affairs itself, because that's where the specimen that I reviewed came from. There was a patient. I got to be careful with HIPAA and patient confidentiality, so I won't say anything, but that I'm not supposed to. But there was a former military service member who came in who claimed to had a UAP experience. Said, I got something in my leg, and they removed it. As they were trying to remove it, it kept moving around. The doctor was trying to, quote unquote, hunt for it. He was very perplexed because when he put it under the microscope, it seemed to have its own metabolism. It was moving under its own power and energy, so to speak.
I mean, who knew Chris Jericho had a podcast, right? It only makes sense. Everyone's got one, right? And he's actually a pretty good interviewer, and it was really good podcast. They had a nice casual conversation. It is audio only. I'll put a link in the description if you want to listen to the rest. It's quite fascinating. So, without further ado, let's jump into what Luis Elizondo actually said in his book about alien implants. And I got to warn you, it's quite shocking.
I spent several hours catching up with Will. Until then, I had not been deeply briefed on what he was doing. The good doctor now took me further into his confidence. Will was always professional and never provided us with patient details. Will served as a medical advisor to OSAP ATIP and Bigelow's NIDS. My former training in microbiology likely made me a bit of a nuisance to Will, kind of like a Cub Scout asking an Army Ranger to be his mentor. But Will was always a gentleman, and if he felt that way, he never let on. My specific interests involved alleged alien implants found in humans. From what I read, often living tissue grew around implants, but such growths never contained anything but the patient's DNA in them. The growths sometimes sprouted multiple brightly colored hairs or filaments, similar to Morgellon fibers. When researchers scrape away the human tissue, they find objects that resemble a technical device in size and shape, but without any circuitry whatsoever. I once handled one of these implants myself, provided to me by a hospital in the Department of Veterans Affairs, where it had been removed from a U.S. military service member who had encountered a UAP. The material, no longer or wider than a joint of one of your fingers, looked more like a microchip encapsulated by a slimy, semi-translucent casing of tissue. It looked very similar to mother of pearl. Under a microscope, it was still moving somehow. The doctor hypothesized that it had its own metabolism. OSAP ATIP had also obtained photographs of these sorts of tiny objects from living foreign military pilots. Some of the specimens that had been removed from individuals were allegedly sent to various medical institutions, such as the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institute of Health, and a U.S. Army research facility at Fort Detrick in Maryland, where some of the most deadly viruses are under lock and key and under the watchful eye of armed guards. Although I asked often, Will never commented to me about any involvement he may have had regarding alleged implants, but it didn't stop me from asking whenever I could. I already knew from other research and interviews that doctors had seen cases where the alleged alien implant evaded extraction by moving subcutaneously when doctors tried to excise it. I heard similar stories when investigating implants removed from otherwise healthy soldiers. Physicians really had to work to pin down and cut out the objects. With my background in microbiology, I was perplexed how highly motile objects such as these could move without creating a devastating path of tissue destruction inside the human body. Where was the white cell response? Where was the destructive immune cascade? I knew from my time studying trypanosomes at the University of Miami that any time these spirochetes moved about under the skin, they would elicit an enormous immune response. Where was this response with regard to the implants? Doctors reported detecting the implant moving, but there weren't any obvious signs of pathway destruction. Like a stealth bomber, the implant moved without any trace or signature, almost as if evading the natural human immune response. It was as if the body didn't know the object was there in the first place. Maybe the implant encouraged the growth of human tissue around itself to keep the body from rejecting it. Post-extraction, some implants moved around the petri dish in which they were confined until they ran out of energy. One theory a doctor told me was that they drew their energy from their host's body. In one particular instance, a senior CIA official and his wife had a terrifying UAP experience in the backyard of their own home. When they awoke lying on the ground in the yard, the CIA officer had a small hole punched in the back of his neck, and his wife had a small metallic object recovered from her nose when she sneezed. Making things even more interesting, CIA doctors were notified of the circumstances and examined the patients. What was the purpose of these implants? Were they tracking devices? Mind control? Did they collect and transmit data on the host's metabolism? Another researcher reported finding long filaments, again akin to Morgellons fibers, moving under their own power while under the microscope, scaring the researcher to the point that she didn't want to study the samples anymore. The objects seemed to have their own metabolism. It was all fascinating, but at the time, Jay and I agreed we had to focus on the nuts and bolts of UAP military encounters in order to effectively navigate future battles with Congress, the DoD, and other agencies.
Now, it's time for that preview of my upcoming interview with Preston Dennett, who is a UFO historian and researcher who has written many books about the phenomena, specifically contactees. Now, in this clip I'm about to show you of my interview that comes out tomorrow, by the way, Preston talks about an implant that was found in his brother's arm and what they did about it. So, here's a short preview of my interview with Preston Dennett that comes out tomorrow.
We know this tracks families. And after my brother's, quote, sighting, this little object appeared in his arm. I took him to a doctor because you could palpate it. It was this little foreign body, like a half matchstick, right on the inner side of his elbow. So I took him to a doctor who was a MUFON field investigator like me, a medical doctor. He touches it and goes, wow, oh my God, we need to x-rays to this. How did this happen? Blah, blah, blah. Because there was no entry wound or anything. No, Mark did not want to go have x-rays. And this thing eventually disappeared. So now I wonder about Mark's sighting because he was 100 feet away from this object. And I've come to realize if you have a sighting and it's less than 1,000 feet away, chances are much higher.
Going up.
Deeper levels of contact there.
Well, there you have it, y'all. Look forward to that interview with Preston Dennett. Again, it comes out tomorrow, Friday, August 23rd. And it's going to be an awesome interview. We talk about the Kingman UFO crash. That's why I brought him on, but we got into a lot more clearly. So, without further ado, I want to bid you adieu. I don't know if that's how you say that. Anyway, thank y'all so much for watching the video. I hope y'all enjoyed this conversation about alien implants, and feel free to look into more of these things, right? Because that is a literal physical piece of evidence we could be studying that could give us a better indication of what is happening, right? And if people get abducted and come back with something in them, I'd say that's worth looking into. So, let me know in the comments how you feel about all this. We'll see you guys on the next video with Preston Dennett. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace!
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep.